Dr. Nardi here, back with another video. And in this video, we are going to talk about the organization and the functions of the central nervous system. So stay tuned, we're about to get into this. So before we go down and we talk about all the aspects of the central nervous system and we talk about the brain in general in some great detail, I want you all to realize something, that the human brain is remarkably resilient. And, you know, it can recover from injury. It can rewire itself. We'll talk about neuroplasticity. We'll talk about how neurons that fire together wire together. You'll know what I mean in a little bit here. But basically that your brain is plastic, as the researchers call it. And it can, change based on experience. Our brain is changing all the time. And sometimes what happens is there's rare conditions with the brain. There's one brain condition called Lysophony, and it basically means smooth brain and no wrinkles. And sometimes individuals, while rare, are born with this condition. And this condition can result in profound impairments. Now, here's the thing. These people with these smooth brain condition, they might lead normal lives despite this structural abnormality, because all our brains, if you don't have this condition, have folds and ridges, and we'll talk about what the terms are. But these individuals suffer from this, and sometimes they have average, maybe below average intelligence. It just depends. But we, in this video, are going to talk about how remarkable the human brain is. Now, before we get into all the details about the human brain, I want to start off talking about just the central nervous system in general, which actually includes the brain and the spinal cord. So we can break up the central nervous system very easily: brain, spinal cord. And then we also have something called the peripheral nervous system. And we'll get into the two subsystems of the peripheral nervous system. But before we do that, I want to define some terms for everybody out there. You'll hear the word nerve. This is a bundle of axons. And we'll talk about, if you remember previous videos, this is the process of extending the neuron from the cell bodies. And they run together like a multi-wired cable. So these axons kind of form these neural networks. There's a term called tracts, and this is the name for a bundle of axons inside the central nervous system. You might also hear the word nucleus, and this is a group of cell bodies within the central nervous system. If you hear ganglion, this is a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So not part of the central nervous system, but in the peripheral nervous system. So again, these are just terms we should know, right? So it depends on where they're located. So again, a bundle of axon in the peripheral nervous system is called a nerve. That's not an individual neuron. That's a bundle of axons. If you're talking about a bundle of axons in the central nervous system, we call that a tract. And a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, again, is a ganglion, and a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called a nucleus. Again, important terms as we go through this video and future videos. These are good terms to know. Now we can kind of talk about the brain, and I want to break the brain down into different areas. I want to talk about the forebrain. And the major structures of the forebrain are the two cerebral hemispheres. We also have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, the outer layer of the hemispheres, the cortex, is where our highest level of processing occurs in the brain. Now, if we want to just focus on the cerebral hemispheres, now these are large wrinkled structures which dominate the brain's appearance. So if you look at a brain, you'll see all these wrinkles, and we'll define some of those terms in just a minute. And humans have disproportionately large cerebral hemispheres, even in relation to other primates. So if you were to look at a monkey's brain, or a chimpanzee's brain, and you compare them, our cerebral hemispheres are much larger in comparison. The other structure we want to talk about is the longitudinal fissure. Now, this is a division running the length of the brain, which separates the two hemispheres. And here's the thing about the two hemispheres. They are almost mirror images of each other. And often the same area of each hemisphere has identical functions. Now, we could talk about a simple form of asymmetry. So each hemisphere receives most sensory input and primary controls from the opposite side of the body. So what I mean by that is the right hemisphere primarily controls the left side of the body, and vice versa. And we'll talk about some exceptions to that rule. And we can also talk about the ridges and grooves of the brain surfaces. They're described as convoluted, and we'll talk about what these ridges and fissures are all about. I also want to talk about other parts of the brain, and these terms are important to know. If you hear the word gyrus, this is each ridge in the surface of the brain. You might hear sulcus. These are the grooves or spaces between two gyri. Fissure, that's a large groove or space between two gyri. And also the cortex. And this is the outer surface of the brain, which I mentioned previously, which is made up mostly of cell bodies of neurons. Now, here's the thing. Cell bodies are not myelinated, and this results in a grayish appearance rather than a whitish one. And this is where that term gray matter comes from, is because of these cell bodies. Now, neural processing occurs where one neuron synapses onto another neuron, making the cortex a central part of cognition. Now, the cortex is only about 1.4 to 4.0 millimeters thick. Now, but if we think about these convolutions, these ridges and folds in the cortex, all these ridges and folds, if you were to unfold it, it would make it basically triple the surface area because of all these little folds and everything. Convolutions also provide axons with freer access to more cell bodies than a thickened cortex would. Now, these axons come together in large bands in the central core of the gyrus, which is where the myelination of the axons gives the area a whitish appearance. And this is where you hear that word white matter. Now, bands of axons serve as a communication routes within and between the two hemispheres. And we'll talk about what we call the corpus callosum, which allows the two hemispheres to communicate. Now, the human cortex, and actually the cortex of most mammals, let's be fair, typically has 6 layers, though some of these layers may be absent in some areas. Now, the layers are distinct in a few important ways. They are all separated by fibers that serve the cell bodies. They also vary in type and size of cells. And they all have different concentrations of cell bodies, which basically lets them serve several functions. So layer 1 is inhibitory. Layers 2 and 3 are associational. Layer 4 is sensory. Layer 5 and 6 really serve motor functions. So they all have different functions. We can also talk about cells of the cortex, which are grouped into columns of 80 to 100 interconnected neurons, which run perpendicular to the cortical surface and unify the cortex as a horizontal layer. So it unifies those horizontal layers. Now, the columns themselves are primarily information processing units in the cortex, with each cell in the column serving as an interrelated function and surrounding columns performing similar functions. Now, these closely located related processes to one another and their interconnecting columns to one to one another increases the speed and efficiency of the brain. Now, there is a small and highly variable relationship between the size of the brain and intelligence. People with larger brains may tend to be more intelligent, but other factors are much more important. Now, often though, brain size is more related to body size than intelligence. Again, it's all kind of relative. Now, each hemisphere is named after the skull bone in which it covers. And the divisions of the lobes are somewhat arbitrary, but are useful for locating structures and functions. Now, there are some terms you should know, especially if you're going to neuroscience. And let me go over some of those terms with you. Dorsal, that's a direction meaning towards the back. Ventral is a directional term meaning towards the stomach. Now, these are all directional terms, just FYI. Anterior means towards the front. Posterior means towards the rear. Superior means above another structure. Inferior means below another structure. If you heard the word lateral, that means towards the side. Medial means towards the middle. Now, we could talk about where the lobes are generally located. Now, the frontal lobe is located anterior to the central sulcus and superior to the lateral fissures. Now, do you see where these terms are actually coming in handy? Now, the central sulcus, that's a sulcus which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Then we have our lateral fissure. That's a prominent fissure which separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. The functions of the frontal lobes are complex, and they really control all these higher order human functionings, which we'll talk about, like planning, reasoning, decision making. The prefrontal gyrus extends the length of the sulcus, and don't worry, we're going to go through all of these areas in this video. Now, the motor cortex, it's located in the prefrontal gyrus. This structure controls voluntary, meaning non-reflexive movement. The motor area in one hemisphere primarily controls the opposite side of the body. The motor area in one hemisphere primarily controls the opposite side of the body. The parts of the body are mapped out onto the motor area of each hemisphere in the form of a homunculus. That actually means little man. And I will talk about that in just 1 minute. I'm going to show you a picture of how this is all mapped out. Now, this is the homunculus, or little man, and you can kind of see what parts of movement are kind of mapped onto this. And you can see the areas that need more precision motor control actually take up more space on the homunculus. And like other functional areas, the primary motor cortex works in tandem with adjacent secondary areas. Broca's area is a region which controls speech production. It contributes to grammatical structure and motor control involved in speech. Broca's area is located anterior to the motor area and along the lateral fissure. Now, that prefrontal cortex that I've mentioned a couple times here is a region involved with planning, organization, like deciding on what behaviors you're going to do or not do. So it's that decision-making process. It's adjusting your behavior in response to consequences. And it's really planning and achieving your goal. Now, the prefrontal cortex is more anterior part of the frontal lobes and is highly complex. It's the largest region in the human brain and accounts for about 29% of all cortical areas. Now, if there's a malfunction in the prefrontal cortex, this tends to strike at our most human, or what makes us human, right? And if you think of some of the disorders that people suffer from, like schizophrenia and depression, these are associated with dysregulation with the prefrontal cortex. And individuals with prefrontal cortex damage, they could understand social and moral standards and consequences in their behavior, but They are often unable to choose wisely amongst their options, and they often get themselves into trouble. Now, a lot of research talks about how important the prefrontal cortex is for learning, especially from punishment and reward. It's involved with impulse control and, again, behavioral flexibility in choosing the appropriate action for the appropriate situation. So the prefrontal cortex is so involved and so important for our everyday lives. Now, in the 1940s and 1950s, surgeons used to perform lobotomies, and basically they would detach the prefrontal area from the rest of the brain. Now, originally, lobotomies were only performed on patients with severe schizophrenia, but doctors were super enthusiastic, and they performed this on patients with much milder conditions, and about 40,000 people got lobotomies. And actually, the scientist that invented it won a Nobel Peace Prize for it, but that's a different story. Now, what happened as a result of these lobotomies, agitated patients were calm, but basically patients became emotionally blunted. They became childlike in their behavior. Patients were unable to live independently anymore, and half of them remained hospitalized after their procedure. Again, this is called psychosurgery, and this is the use of surgical intervention to treat cognitive and emotional disorders. Now, psychosurgery is strongly disfavored today, so we don't really see psychosurgery. Now, we can talk a little bit about the parietal lobes. These are located superior to the lateral and between the central sulcus and the occipital lobe. We could also mention the primary somasensory cortex. That's located on the postcentral gyrus, and that processes skin sensations such as touch and warmth and cold and pain, and the senses that inform us about the body's position and movement. So where your body is in 3D space. Now, sensory areas of the brain are often referred to as projection areas. We also have association areas, areas which carry out further processing beyond the primary area does, often combining information from other areas. And again, if you have an issue with any one of these areas, you could suffer from various disorders, which I will not go too far into in this video. But one is neglect, and that's a disorder in which a person ignores objects, people, and activities on the opposite side where the damage occurred. Neglect occurs most often when the posterior parietal cortex is damaged, particularly if the damage occurs in the right parietal lobe. Some other parts of the brain I want to mention are the temporal lobes. Now, these are regions containing the auditory projection area, the visual and auditory association areas, and an additional language area. And again, these structures are important in learning and memory. So we could talk about the auditory cortex. This is a region which receives sound information from the ears and lies on the superior gyrus of the temporal lobe. It's mostly hidden from view within the lateral fissure. We could talk about Wernicke's area. This is an association area that interprets language. Basically, it receives input arriving from nearby auditory and visual areas. It also generates spoken language through Broca's area and written language by the way of the motor cortex. Wernicke's area is located just posterior to the auditory cortex. When damaged, the individual can speak. It's primarily nonsense or word salad, but may struggle to understand speech or writing. We can also talk about the inferior temporal cortex. This is located in the lower part of the lobe. As its name implies, it plays a major role in the visual identification of objects. Now, people with damage to the inferior temporal cortex can give you detailed descriptions of familiar objects or recognize them by other senses, but struggle to recognize these familiar objects or people by sight. The temporal lobe also appears to play an important role in memory. One important way of determining the function of brain areas is by stimulating functional areas during brain surgeries of conscious patients, just as an FYI tidbit there. Now, the occipital lobes This is the location of the visual cortex. And the visual cortex is the region where visual information is processed. Primary projection areas occupies the posterior tip of each lobe. Anterior to the primary projection areas are 4 association areas that dictate individual components of a scene like color, movement, and form. Information from all 4 areas is combined and sent to the association areas for further processing. We can also talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, the thalamus is a region that lies just between the lateral ventricles, where it receives information from all the sensory systems except for olfaction, which is smell, and relays it to the respective cortical projection areas. Now, there's technically actually 2 thalami, right and left, which sit side by side, but we just say thalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is a smaller structure just inferior to the thalamus, which plays a role in controlling emotion and motivated behaviors such as eating, drinking, and sexual activity. The pituitary gland, known as the master gland, secretes hormones which controls other glands in the body. Like the thalami, there are 2 paired halves of the hypothalamus. We can also talk about the pineal gland, a gland which secretes melatonin, a hormone that induces sleep. It controls the seasonal cycle of non-human animals and participates with other structures of controlling your daily rhythms in life, right? Now, the pineal gland is unpaired structure that is attached by a flexible stalk just below the hemispheres. Now, the corpus callosum, it's basically a large bundle of dense fibers that carry information between the 2 hemispheres. And it allows the 2 hemispheres to share information. It allows them actually to communicate. And there's been research where they've cut the corpus callosum between patients. And it's very interesting what happens to these individuals. I may make another whole video about just severing the corpus callosum and seeing what happens with people who have that surgery, most of the time to stop seizures. We can also talk about the ventricles. Now, ventricles are cavities in the brain which develop from the hollow interior of the nervous system. Lateral ventricles extend forward deeply into the frontal lobes and backward into the occipital lobes before curving into the temporal lobes. The third ventricle is located between the 2 thalami and the 2 halves of the hypothalamus. The 4th ventricle is not located in the forebrain. Now, cerebral spinal fluid carries material from the blood vessels to the central nervous system, and it actually takes waste away from the central nervous system as well. We can actually talk about the midbrain and hindbrain. Now, the midbrain contains structures that have secondary roles in vision, hearing, and movement. Now, we can talk about the superior colliculi, structures that help guide eye movements and the fixation of gaze. And we could also talk about the inferior colliculi, structures that help locate the direction of sound. We could talk about the hindbrain, and we'll talk about the pons. It's a region which contains centers related to sleep and arousal, again, which is part of that reticular formation. Now, the reticular formation, in case you're wondering, is a collection of nuclei running through the middle of the hindbrain and the midbrain. Now, the reticular formation has an important role in sleep, arousal, attention, and aspects of motor activity, including reflexes and muscle tone. The medulla forms the lower part of the hindbrain. Its nuclei are involved with control of essential life processes, such as cardiovascular activity and respiration. Now, the cerebellum refines movements initiated by the motor cortex by controlling their speed, intensity, and direction. And if you damage the cerebellum, this can result in imprecise movements and difficulty with automatic patterning of movements, like routines like walking and taking the stairs. And the cerebellum also plays a role in motor learning. It's also thought to be involved in cognitive processes, procedural memory, and emotion. Now, the cerebellum contains about 70% of the brain's neurons. Of course, we have to talk about the spinal cord. It's a large finger-sized cable of neurons that carries commands from the brain to the muscles and the organs and sensory information to the brain. It also controls reflex responses. It contains pattern generators to assist in routine behaviors such as walking. And it contains white matter on the outside and gray matter in the center. The dorsal root, it's a region of the spinal nerve where sensory neurons enter the spinal cord. The ventral root is the region in which axons of the motor neurons pass out of the spinal cord. Now the dorsal root and the ventral root combine to form a spinal nerve that exits the spine between the adjacent vertebrae. Now spinal nerves carry information between the central nervous system and specific regions of the body that each nerve serves. And by the way, if you hear the word reflex, that's just a simple automatic movement in response to sensory stimuli. And your spinal cord really handles all your reflexes. It would take way too long for your brain to get information and send it back to your body. So usually the spine is much faster, so it handles the reflexes, just as an FYI. So you might be wondering, what protects the central nervous system? Because the brain and spinal cord are vulnerable to damage from physical trauma, poisoning, or chemical disruption from neurotransmitters. The central nervous system is actually very fragile, and it's enclosed in a tough membrane to protect these vital parts of our body. Meninges is a protective 3-layer membrane, and we also have what we call the blood-brain barrier. Now this limits passage between the bloodstream and the brain, and it provides constant protection from toxic substances and from neurotransmitters circulating into the blood. Now fat-soluble substances can enter the brain by dissolving through lipids in capillary walls, and fat-soluble is the primary reason that most drugs, therapeutic or otherwise, are able to affect the brain. Now, water-soluble substances needed by the brain cannot pass through on their own, so they must be carried through the walls by specialized transporters. And not all areas are protected by the barrier. Structures surrounding the ventricles can be vulnerable to toxic substances, just as an FYI. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, share this video, comment on the video. Did I get something wrong? Let me know down below. And with all that said, I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.